gospel reads a little bit like a middle school lunchroom. I think the cafeteria is one of the hardest places in middle school. You have no choice but to go there, and there's this inevitable pecking order that happens. I can remember walking into the lunchroom, holding my lunch tray and surveying the crowd, trying to be nonchalant, but at the same time performing multiple calculations to decide where I should sit. There were obvious places to avoid: the cool person table, the upperclassmen, the athletes. But even then, finding a place to sit meant hoping that someone would look up and smile, and not just look down, eyes fixed on their own tray, as if I wasn't even there. It was a nightmare. And that's the memory that this gospel calls up: the social sorting, the invisible lines of who belongs and who doesn't, the quiet rules about where you are allowed to sit. In our reading, Jesus is attending a banquet at an important person's house. And to me, it sounds just like the lunchroom. People were trying to figure out where to sit and how to get to the cool table. And Jesus tells them that all these calculations will backfire. If you sit in the spot that you're not supposed to sit, you'll be humiliated and told to leave. And I think it's probably even deeper than that. When you're looking at a group trying to decide where you fit, you're judging the value of others and the value of yourself. The tacit dialogue is, well, okay, I'm better than that table, or I'm better than him, but I'm not quite good enough for that table, and so on. That is not the kingdom of God. In God's kingdom, all of the tables are open seating. What Jesus is really exposing is how much of our life is shaped by comparison. We measure ourselves against one another. We look for cues about who is important and who is not. And we angle for position because we think our value depends on being higher than someone else. But at God's table, the calculations end. There are no reserved seats. No one gets moved to the margins, and no one is left standing with a tray in hand. The whole point of God's banquet is that every person belongs, and the place of honor is not won by status, but it is given by grace. And then Jesus goes further. He shifts the focus from where you sit to who you invite. When you give a banquet, he says, don't just call your friends or your relatives and the people who can pay you back. Invite the poor, the lame, or the blind. In other words, don't build your guest list around social advantage. Don't use hospitality as another way of proving your status. The kingdom of God is not about trading favors. It is about opening your life so that those who are usually left standing with their trays in hand have a place at the table. When Jesus speaks of the banquet, he's not only talking about a meal. The table becomes a picture of life itself, how we structure our relationships and our priorities. Every day, we are setting a table with our choices. Whom do we make room for? Who do we notice? The table is our calendar, our dinner conversations, and it's even the way we spend our money. In God's vision, that table is not fixed or exclusive. It opens outward like an ever-expanding circle, drawing more people into its welcome. And this all sounds nice, but I actually think it's really challenging. For me, I don't struggle with the idea of that God welcomes the hungry or the sick or the stranger. I struggle when I think about those who make exclusion their practice, those who divide communities, or those who thrive on keeping others out. I catch myself thinking that it is acceptable to exclude the excluders. This is the sharp edge of Jesus' teaching. The challenge of an ever-expanding circle is that it doesn't just stretch towards people we already feel compassion for. It also presses outward to those that we would rather not claim. That's where the prophetic weight of this gospel lands. God's welcome does not stop where our comfort zones stop. The instinct is to draw a line against those who exclude or demean others. It's very human. Most of us feel this tension. On the one hand, we long to defend the vulnerable and stand up against hatred. On the other, Jesus keeps calling us back to a love that does not end at our enemy's doorstep. In the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. That doesn't mean that we have to excuse harm or stay silent in the face of injustice, but it does mean refusing to mirror the very exclusion that we oppose. I think one way for us to be able to hold these ideas together is to distinguish between resisting harmful actions and rejecting people outright. We can and must say no to racism, xenophobia, or any ways of dehumanizing others. But at the same time, we can resist the temptation to write people out of God's story. The kingdom's circle stretches even to those whose choices wound others. That doesn't lessen their accountability, but it does remind us that God never stops inviting, even the ones that we can't imagine sitting with. And what this means for us is not to throw open the doors without discernment or abandon the work of justice. But I think it does mean that even as we stand firm against what diminishes human dignity, that we refuse to believe that anyone is beyond the reach of God's love. Our part is not to decide who deserves a seat, but to pray, to listen, and to let God's desire for reconciliation shape our own hearts. Sometimes that prayer will move us to speak truth, and sometimes it will move us to create space for someone we never expected. Always, it'll draw us back to the God whose love is never finished, never exhausted, and never closed off. So the question the gospel leaves us is simple, but it's not easy. How will we set our tables? How will we shape our life together so that no one is left standing at the edges, wondering if there's room for them? At St. Clare's, we actively seek to widen our circle through the meals we cook and deliver, through toilet paper in a garden that feeds our neighbors, through a welcome at the door on Sunday mornings. And each of these is a way of saying, there is a place for you here. And yet, Jesus reminds us that that circle is never finished. There are still voices that we tune out and faces that we overlook. There are neighbors that we find hard to welcome. So the hope of the gospel is that God does not grow tired of widening the circle. God keeps making space and keeps calling us towards a love larger than our own. Our calling is not to measure who belongs, but to let God's welcome shape us until our life together looks more and more like the kingdom's feast.